Hello. All right. What I want to talk about here is connections and the links uh, that are used in the diagram tools and what they mean and kind of what it affects as far as when I link something together. What does that actually mean? Uh, it obviously means something visually, but I want to explain kind of what happens whenever you make these connections or links. So on the subsystems, when I'm linking from one subsystem to another, I'm saying that this core, everything inside of it, is going to be included in whatever it's linked to. So in this case, the core would be actually linked to the game. So in the game here, you can see I've got another test element here, and that actually lives inside of the core here. So this way I can kind of separate things out and still link things from other subsystems that don't belong directly in this diagram. And I usually like to kind of organize things in this manner. Depending on each scene, I have one directly associated subsystem. So for the game scene, I have a subsystem called game. For the menu, I have one called menu system. And I would do the same thing for each scene. Any kind of other subsystem, I would then define things that I wanted to be included in those scenes and then link them to the appropriate subsystem. Because whenever I have a subsystem like the core here linked into the game, and since it's associated with this scene is now knows that it needs everything inside of game and everything inside of core. The test main menu knows that it needs everything inside of menu system and core. But since there's no connection between the game and menu system, the main menu will know nothing about the game, or this subsystem will know nothing about this game. I would have to link the game to the menu system. So how you kind of end up organizing these is totally up to you. But the only thing that you have to keep in mind is that ultimately how you include things in this manner is going to end up in this scene. And you just want to make a note of that, as you're going through and defining your subsystems. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is the two different types of element connections and kind of what they mean. So the first connection type we're going to talk about is simple associations. What these associations are for is saying that, like this test game element here has, in this example, one test game player. That's what properties are for. They mean one of something. So in this game we have one player, and we've said that there's one test game item. But because I added a collection here, it actually made this item a multi-instance, meaning that there's going to be many of this test game item in the game. So if I need this test game player and test game item to interact, considering that it is a multi-instance, it doesn't make sense to add a property here and directly associate the test game player to the test game item. Considering there's going to be many of these in the game, and this property means one, there's going to be one test game item to a player, it doesn't completely or entirely make sense for this scenario to link things up in this manner, because there's no way by default the test game player is going to know which instance of the many instanced test game item it's going to need to actually populate this property in code. So this is why in the tutorials I kind of trickle things up, is because there is no association, and because this association doesn't really make sense. So in the tutorials where I took the command pickup item and told the test game element controller about this event happening, I did that because normally if I'm going to give something control, I normally want the test game or the root element here, or the game element if you will, to be kind of like the delegator to the other controllers, and kind of having this one control some of the specifics of the game, especially cases like this that I've just explained. So based off the connections that are represented here, it knows that whenever it creates the controller for test game item, it looks in the entire diagram and finds out what is also has any kind of properties, collections, or commands that are connected to this item. So since the test game element is connected to the test game item, the test game item is then going to have access to this controller. So when generated, it creates a property and automatically decorates that in the scene manager for you. This is all automatic, so you don't really have to worry about how those properties are getting filled. You just have it to work with because it's associated together. So this works both ways too. So now that these things are associated, the test game element has a reference to the controller for test game item, as well as the test game item has a reference to the actual game element here, or a reference to its controller. It would be the same with the test game player and the test game element. This would have a reference to the test game player controller, and vice versa. So in the case where you don't have a connection between something and you need them to communicate, you can almost just look at the lines and kind of follow the lines and know what you need to call so that it can handle that operation for you, communicating with something else. So where the test game item needed to communicate with the test game player, I just said, hey, game element, I'm not really allowed to talk to the test game player. Take care of this for me. So then, if I wanted to create another subsystem where I derived from test game element, and I wanted to create a whole new type of game where the specifics of things are different, I can handle this pickup item completely different. So that in itself brings me to my next link type for an element. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to keep everything in the same diagram just for this demonstration. But normally when I do this, I would probably throw it into another subsystem and then link this subsystem into that one. And consider this kind of like my core, if you will. But like I said, I'm going to keep it in here. So say in that case I wanted to create a test game 2 element. And then I'm going to control click on the element. And note that I'm not clicking on an item here to create an item association. I'm actually clicking on the element. And this will create inheritance. And what that means is everything from this test game element and its controller and its view model, everything generated from this is going to be also included in the test game 2 element. So now this test 2 game 2 element has a property of, well, if I had better names here, player and game item and game items. Maybe this property is called current game item. Alright, just to correct that so this makes more sense for you. Okay, so each property, collection, and command visually by the red line here means that test game 2 element also has this player, this current game item, game items, and new command. We don't include those here because that would really make things grow to be very large. So just know that this association means that this is the same thing as the test game element, but I want to add a little bit more to it and get a little bit more specific about it, if you will. So in this case, maybe this game element is considered a different game type. And I've actually got a better example for this than that. Included we have the FPS shooter, and I'm going to show you what I mean by going into the waves here, where I had the FPS game. When I included that into waves, I'm actually saying that Waves FPS game is a FPS game, but I'm going to get more specific about it. This way I could create, maybe I wanted a deathmatch game. So deathmatch game. So what this allows me to do is I can then say that deathmatch game is also an FPS game. So I control drag over to the deathmatch game. So then in the controllers, I could keep things specific to the Waves FPS game here and things specific to the deathmatch game, but I don't have to recreate everything that I've already specified or created in the controllers for the FPS game. I can further define things here. And just a note before I conclude the tutorial, I did, in this one diagram, I was playing with the colors, so this should actually be red, meaning that it is inheritance. It's not a association link. And if I go into the weapon here, I just want to note that the only other things that also work with inheritance are the components and the views. So if I had another view here and I link this up, that means this view is going to get everything of this FPS weapon view, but I'm going to further define it a little bit more. And same with the components. This might all be somewhat confusing at first, but as you start building your game, you'll definitely run into scenarios like this where you need stuff like this, and it'll start to make sense, especially when you are actually at the point where you need to start defining how you're going to visually represent your elements. That's when you'll need or run into cases where you need things of this nature. But to get started, I think you should just focus on the elements and the associations or the inheritance before you get into the views and the inheritance of this kind of stuff. Because this will click and start to make sense. But until you kind of get how the elements work and the connections work together, I would stay focused on this till it starts to make a little bit more sense. So you can even go in and start working with your controllers and writing the code before you ever go in and create the views. It'll really help you understand things if you create the elements and start writing code with the controllers as well. So I think that's just about everything as far as the connections concerned that I want to talk about. So I hope this tutorial has been helpful, and thanks for watching.